The Book of Dragons by Edith Nesbit. The Deliverers of Their Country. It all began with Effie's getting something in her eye. It hurt very much indeed, and it felt something like a red-hot spark. Only it seemed to have legs as well, and wings like a fly. Effie rubbed and cried, not real crying, but the kind your eye does all by itself without your being miserable inside your mind, and then she went to her father to have the thing in her eye taken out. Effie's father was a doctor, so of course he knew how to take things out of eyes. He did it very cleverly, with a soft paintbrush dipped in castor oil. When he had gotten the thing out, he said, "This is very curious." Effie had often got things in her eye before, and her father had always seemed to think it was natural. Rather tiresome and naughty, perhaps, but still natural. He had never before thought it curious. Effie stood holding her handkerchief to her eye and said, "I don't believe it's out." People always say this when they have had something in their eyes. "Oh yes, it's out," said the doctor. "There it is, on the brush. This is very interesting." Effie had never heard her father say that about anything that she had any share in. She said, "What?" The doctor carried the brush very carefully across the room and held the point of it under his microscope. Then he twisted the brass screws of the microscope and looked through the top with one eye. "Dear me," he said, dear me. 4 well-developed limbs, a long caudal appendage, 5 toes unequal in lengths, almost like one of the Lacertidae, yet there are traces of wings." The creature under his eye wriggled a little in the castor oil and went on. "Yes, a bat-like wing, a new specimen, undoubtedly. Effie, run around to the professor and ask him to be kind enough to step in for a few minutes." "You might give me a 6pence, Daddy," said Effie, "because I did bring you the new specimen. I took great care of it inside my eye, and my eye does hurt." The doctor was so pleased with the new specimen that he gave Effie a shilling, and presently the professor stepped round. He stayed to lunch, and he and the doctor quarrelled very happily all the afternoon about the name and the family of the thing that had come out of Effie's eye. But at tea time, another thing happened. Effie's brother Harry fished something out of his tea, which he thought at first was an earwig. He was just getting ready to drop it on the floor and end its life in the usual way, when it shook itself in the spoon, spread 2 wet wings, and flopped onto the tablecloth. And there it sat, stroking itself with its feet and stretching its wings, and Harry said, "Oh, aye, it's a tiny newt." The professor leaned forward before the doctor could say a word. "I'll give you 1/2 crown for it, Harry, my lad," he said, speaking very fast, and then he picked it up carefully on his handkerchief. "It is a new specimen," he said, "and finer than yours, doctor." It was a tiny lizard about 1/2 an inch long, with scales and wings. So now the doctor and the professor each had a specimen, and they were both very pleased. But before long, these specimens began to seem less valuable, for the next morning, when the knife boy was cleaning the doctor's boots, he suddenly dropped the brushes and the boot and the blacking and screamed out that he was burnt. And from inside the boot came crawling a lizard as big as a kitten, with large, shiny wings. "Why," said Effie, "I know what it is. It is a dragon, like the one St. George killed." And Effie was right. That afternoon, Towser was bitten in the garden by a dragon about the size of a rabbit, which he had tried to chase, and the next morning all the papers were full of the wonderful winged lizards that were appearing all over the country. The papers would not call them dragons because, of course, no one believes in dragons nowadays, and at any rate, the papers were not going to be so silly as to believe in fairy stories. At first, there were only a few, but in a week or two, The country was simply running alive with dragons of all sizes, and in the air you could sometimes see them as thick as a swarm of bees. They all looked alike except as to size. They were green with scales, and they had 4 legs and a long tail and great wings like bats' wings, only the wings were a pale, half-transparent yellow, like the gearboxes of bicycles. They breathed fire and smoke, as all proper dragons must, but still, the newspapers went on pretending they were lizards, until the editor of the Standard was picked up and carried away by a very large one. And then the other newspaper people had not anyone left to tell them what they ought not to believe. So, when the largest elephant in the zoo was carried off by a dragon, the papers gave up pretending and put "Alarming Plague of Dragons" at the top of the paper. You have no idea how alarming it was, and at the same time how aggravating. The large-sized dragons were terrible, certainly, but when once you had found out that the dragons always went to bed early because they were afraid of the chill night air, you had only to stay indoors all day, and you were pretty safe from the big ones. But the smaller sizes were a perfect nuisance. The ones as big as earwigs got in the soap, and they got in the butter. The ones as big as dogs got in the bath, and the fire and smoke inside them made them steam like anything when the cold water tap was turned on, so that careless people were often scolded quite severely. The ones that were as large as pigeons would get into work baskets or corner drawers and bite you when you were in a hurry to get a needle or a handkerchief. The ones as big as sheep were easier to avoid because you could see them coming, but when they flew in at the windows and curled up under your eiderdown and you did not find them until you went to bed, it was always a shock. The ones this size did not eat people, only lettuce, but they always scorched the sheets and pillowcases dreadfully. Of course, the county council and the police did everything that could be done. It was no use offering the hand of the princess to anyone who killed a dragon. This way was all very well in olden times when there was only one dragon and one princess, but now there were far more dragons than princesses, although the royal family was a large one. And besides, it would have been a mere waste of princesses to offer rewards for killing dragons, because everybody killed as many dragons as they could, quite out of their own heads and without rewards at all, just to get the nasty things out of the way. The county council undertook to cremate all dragons delivered at their offices between the hours of 10 and 2, and whole wagon loads and cart loads and truck loads of dead dragons could be seen any day of the week, standing in a long line in the street where the county council had their offices. Boys brought barrel loads of dead dragons, and children on their way home from morning school would call in to leave the handful or two of little dragons they had brought in their satchels or carried in their knotted pocket handkerchiefs. And yet, there seemed to be as many dragons as ever. Then, the police stuck up great wood and canvas towers covered with patent glue. When the dragons flew against these towers, they stuck fast, as flies and wasps do on the sticky papers in the kitchen, and when the towers were covered all over with dragons, the police inspector used to set fire to the towers and burnt them, and dragons and all. And yet, there seemed to be more dragons than ever. The shops were full of patent dragon poison and anti-dragon soap, and dragon-proof curtains for the windows, and indeed everything that could be done was done. And yet, there seemed to be more dragons than ever. It was not very easy to know what would poison a dragon because, you see, they ate such different things. The largest kind ate elephants as long as there were any, and then went on with horses and cows. Another size ate nothing but lilies of the valley, and a third size ate only prime ministers, if they were to be had, and if not, would feed freely on servants in livery. Another size lived on bricks, and 3 of them ate 2/3 of the South Lambeth infirmary in one afternoon. But the size Effie was most afraid of was about as big as your dining room, and that size ate little girls and boys. At first, Effie and her brother were quite pleased with the change in their lives. It was so amusing to sit up all night instead of going to sleep, and to play in the garden lighted by electric lamps. And it sounded so funny to hear Mother say, when they were going to bed, "Good night, my darlings. Sleep sound all day, and don't get up too soon. You must not get up before it's quite dark. You wouldn't like the nasty dragons to catch you." But after a time, they got very tired of it all. They wanted to see the flowers and trees growing in the fields, and to see the pretty sunshine out of doors, and not just through glass windows and patent dragon-proof curtains. And they wanted to play on the grass, which they were not allowed to do in the electric lamp-lighted garden because of the night dew. And they wanted so much to get out, just for once, in the beautiful, bright, dangerous daylight, that they began to try and think of some reason why they ought to go out. Only, they did not like to disobey their mother. But one morning, their mother was busy preparing some new dragon poison to lay down in the cellars, and their father was bandaging the hand of the boot boy, which had been scratched by one of the dragons who liked to eat prime ministers when there was none to be had. So nobody remembered to say to the children, "Don't get up till it is quite dark." "Go now," said Harry. "It would not be disobedient to go, and I know exactly what we ought to do, but I don't know how we ought to do it." "What ought we to do?" said Effie. "We ought to wake St. George, of course," said Harry. "He was the only person in his town who knew how to manage dragons. The people in the fairy tales don't count, but St. George is a real person, and he is only asleep, and he is waiting to be waked up. Only nobody believes in St. George now. I heard Father say so." "We do," said Effie. "Of course we do, and don't you see, Eff, that's the very reason why we could wake him. You can't wake people if you don't believe in them, can you?" Effie said no, but where could they find St. George? "We must go and look," said Harry boldly. "You shall wear a dragon-proof frock made of stuff like the curtains, and I will smear myself all over with the best dragon poison, and—" Effie clasped her hands and skipped with joy and cried, "Oh, Harry, I know where we can find St. George. In St. George's church, of course." Said Harry, wishing he had thought of it for himself. "You have a little sense sometimes, for a girl." So the next afternoon, quite early, long before the beams of sunset announced the coming night, when everybody would be up and working, the 2 children got out of bed. Effie wrapped herself in a shawl of dragon-proof muslin. There was no time to make the frock, and Harry made a horrid mess of himself with the patent dragon poison. It was warranted harmless to infants and invalids, so he felt quite safe. Then they joined hands and set out to walk to St. George's Church. As you know, there are many St. George's churches, but fortunately they took the turning that leads to the right one and went along in the bright sunlight, feeling very brave and adventurous. There was no one about in the streets except dragons, and the place was simply swarming with them. Fortunately, none of the dragons were just the right size for eating little boys and girls, or perhaps the story might have had to end here. There were dragons on the pavement and dragons on the roadway, dragons basking on the front doorsteps of public buildings, and dragons preening their wings on the roofs in the hot afternoon sun. The town was quite green with them. Even when the children had gotten out of the town and were walking in the lanes, they noticed that the fields on each side were greener than usual, with the scaly legs and tails, and some of the four smaller sizes had made themselves asbestos nests in the flowering hawthorn hedges. Effie held her brother's hand very tight, and once, when a fat dragon flopped against her ear, she screamed out, and a whole flight of green dragons rose from the field at the sound and sprawled away across the sky. The children could hear the rattle of their wings as they flew. "Oh, I want to go home," said Effie. "Don't be silly," said Harry. "Surely you haven't forgotten about the 7 champions and all the princes. People who are going to be their country's deliverers never scream and say they want to go home." "And are we," asked Effie, "deliverers, I mean?" "You'll see," said her brother, and on they went. When they came to St. George's Church, they found the door open and they walked right in. But St. George was not there, so they walked around the churchyard outside, and presently they found the great stone tomb of St. George, with the figure of him carved in marble outside, in his armour and helmet, and with his hands folded on his breast. "How can we ever wake him?" they said. Then Harry spoke to St. George, but he would not answer, and he had called, but St. George did not seem to hear. And then he actually tried to waken the great dragon slayer by shaking his marble shoulders. But St. George took no notice. Then Effie began to cry, and she put her arms around St. George's neck as well as she could for the marble, which was very much in the way at the back, and she kissed the marble face, and she said, "Oh dear, good, kind St. George, please wake up and help us." And at that, St. George opened his eyes sleepily and stretched himself and said, "What's the matter, little girl?" So the children told him all about it. He turned over in his marble and leaned on one elbow to listen. But when he heard that there were so many dragons, he shook his head. "It's no good," he said. "They would be one too many for poor old George. You should have waked me before. I was always for a fair fight. 1 man, 1 dragon was my motto." Just then a flight of dragons passed overhead, and St. George half drew his sword. But then he shook his head again and pushed the sword back as the flight of dragons grew small in the distance. "I can't do anything," he said. "Things have changed since my time. St. Andrew told me about it. They woke him up over the engineers' strike, and he came to talk to me. He says everything is done by machinery now. There must be some way of settling these dragons. By the way, what sort of weather have you been having lately?" This seemed so careless and unkind that Harry would not answer, but Effie said patiently, "It has been very fine. Father says it is the hottest weather there has ever been in this country." "Ah, I guessed as much," said the champion thoughtfully. "Well, the only thing would be, dragons can't stand wet and cold, and that's the only thing. If you could find the taps—" St. George was beginning to settle down again on his stone slab. "Good night. Very sorry, I can't help you," he said, yawning behind his marble hand. "Oh, but you can," cried Effie. "Tell us. What taps?" "Oh, like in the bathroom," said St. George, still more sleepily. "And there's a looking-glass, too. It shows you all the world and what's going on. St. Denis told me about it and said it was a very pretty thing. I'm sorry, I can't. Good night." And he fell back into his marble and was fast asleep again in a moment. We shall never find the taps, said Harry. I say, wouldn't it be awful if St. George woke up when there was a dragon near, the size that eats champions? Effie pulled off her dragon-proof veil. We didn't meet any the size of the dining room as we came along, she said. I dare say we shall be quite safe. So she covered St. George with the veil, and Harry rubbed off as much as he could of the dragon poison onto St. George's armour, so as to make everything quite safe for him. We might hide in the church till it is dark, he said, and then... But at that moment, a dark shadow fell on them, and they saw that it was a dragon, exactly the size of the dining room at home. So then they knew that all was lost. The dragon swooped down and caught the two children in his claws. He caught Effie by her green silk sash and Harry by the little point at the back of his ʔɪᴏ jacket, and then, spreading his great yellow wings, he rose into the air, rattling like a third-class carriage when the brake is on. "Oh, Harry," said Effie, "I wonder when he will eat us." The dragon was flying across woods and fields with great flaps of his wings that carried him 1/4 of a mile at each flap. Harry and Effie could see the country below, hedges and rivers and churches and farmhouses flowing away from under them, much faster than you see them running away from the sides of the fastest express train. And still, the dragon flew on. The children saw other dragons in the air as they went, but the dragon, who was as big as a dining room, never stopped to speak to any of them, but just flew on, quite steadily. "He knows where he wants to go," said Harry. "Oh, if he would only drop us before he gets there." But the dragon held on tight, and he flew and flew and flew, until at last, when the children were quite giddy, he settled down with a rattling of all his scales on the top of a mountain. And he lay there on his great green scaly hide, panting, and very much out of breath because he had come such a long way. But his claws were fast in Effie's sash and the little point at the back of Harry's ʔɪᴏ jacket. Then Effie took out the knife Harry had given her on her birthday. It cost only 6 pence to begin with, and she had had it a month, and it could never sharpen anything but slate pencils, but somehow she managed to make that knife cut her sash in front, and crept out of it, leaving the dragon with only a silk green bow in one of his claws. That knife would never have cut Harry's jacket tail off, though, and when Effie had tried for some time, she saw that this was so, and gave it up. But with her help, Harry managed to wriggle quietly out of his sleeves, so that the dragon had only an ʔɪᴏ jacket in his other claw. Then the children crept on tiptoe to a crack in the rocks and got in. It was much too narrow for the dragon to get in also, so they stayed in there and waited to make faces at the dragon when he felt rested enough to sit up and begin to think about eating them. He was very angry indeed when they made faces at him and blew out fire and smoke at them, but they ran farther into the cave so that he could not reach them, and when he was tired of blowing, he went away. But they were afraid to come out of the cave, and so they went farther in, and presently the cave opened out and grew bigger, and the floor was soft sand, and when they had come to the very end of the cave, there was a door, and on it was written, "Universal Tap Room. Private. No one allowed inside." So they opened the door at once, just to peep in, and then they remembered what St. George had said. "We can't be worse off than we are," said Harry, "with a dragon waiting for us outside. Let's go in." They went boldly into the tap room and shut the door behind them. And now they were in a sort of room cut out of the solid rock, and all along one side of the room were taps, and all the taps were labelled with china labels like you see in baths. And as they both could read words of 2 syllables, or even 3 sometimes, they understood at once that they had got into the place where the weather is turned on from. There were 6 big taps labelled sunshine, wind, rain, snow, hail, ice, and a lot of little ones labelled fair to moderate, showery, south breeze, nice growing weather for the crops, skating, good open weather, south wind, east wind, and so on. And the big tap labelled sunshine was turned full on. They could not see any sunshine. The cave was lighted by the skylight of blue glass, so they supposed the sunlight was pouring out by some other way, as it does with the tap that washes out the underneath parts of patent sinks and kitchens. Then they saw that one side of the room was just a big looking glass, and when you looked at it, you could see everything that was going on in the world, and all at once, too, which is not like most looking glasses. They saw the carts delivering the dead dragons at the county council offices, and they saw St. George asleep under the dragon-proof veil. And they saw their mother at home crying because her children had gone out in the dreadful, dangerous daylight, and she was afraid a dragon had eaten them. And they saw the whole of England like a great puzzle map, green in the field parts and brown in the towns, and black in the places where they make coal and crockery and cutlery and chemicals. All over it, on the black parts and on the brown and on the green, there was a network of green dragons, and they could see that it was still broad daylight and no dragons had gone to bed yet. Effie said, "Dragons do not like cold," and she tried to turn off the sunshine, but the tap was out of order, and that was why there had been so much hot weather, and why the dragons had been able to be hatched. So they left the sunshine tap alone, and they turned on the snow and left the tap full on while they went to look in the glass. There they saw the dragons running all sorts of ways, like ants if you were cruel enough to pour water into an ant heap, which, of course, you never are. And the snow fell more and more. Then Effie turned the rain tap quite full on, and presently the dragons began to wriggle less, and by some of them lay quite still, so the children knew the water had put out the fires inside them, and they were dead. So then they turned on the hail, only half on for fear of breaking people's windows, and after a while there were no more dragons to be seen moving. Then the children knew that they were indeed the deliverers of their country. "They will put up a monument to us," said Harry, "as high as Nelson's. All the dragons are dead." "I hope the one that was waiting outside for us is dead," said Effie. "And about the monument, Harry, I'm not so sure. What can they do with such a lot of dead dragons? It would take years and years to bury them, and they could never be burnt now, they are so soaking wet. I wish the rain would wash them off into the sea." But this did not happen, and the children began to feel that they had not been so frightfully clever after all. "I wonder what this old thing's for," said Harry. He had found a rusty old tap, which seemed as though it had not been used for ages. Its china label was quite coated over with dirt and cobwebs. When Effie had cleaned it with a bit of her skirt, for curiously enough, both the children had come out without pocket handkerchiefs, she found that the label said waste. "Let's turn it on," she said. "It might carry off the dragons." The tap was very stiff from not having been used for such a long time, but together they managed to turn it on and then ran to the mirror to see what happened. Already, a great round black hole had opened in the very middle of the map of England, and the sides of the map were tilting themselves up so that the rain ran down toward the hole. "Oh, hurrah, hurrah, hurrah!" cried Effie. And she hurried back to the taps and turned on everything that seemed wet. Showery, good open weather, nice growing weather for the crops, and even south and southwest, because she had heard her father say that those winds brought rain. And now the floods of rain were pouring down on the country, and great sheets of water flowed toward the center of the map, and cataracts of water poured into the great round hole in the middle of the map, and the dragons were being washed away and disappearing down the waste pipe in great green masses and scattered green shoals, single dragons and dragons by the dozens of all sizes, from the ones that carry off elephants down to the ones that get in your tea. Presently, there was not a dragon left. So then they turned off the tap named Waste, and they half turned off the one labelled Sunshine. It was broken so that they could not turn it off altogether, and they turned on Fair to Moderate and Showery, and both taps stuck so that they could not be turned off, which accounts for our climate. How did they get home again? By the Snowdon Railway, of course. And was the nation grateful? Well, the nation was very wet, and by the time the nation had gotten dry again, it was interested in the new invention for toasting muffins by electricity, and all the dragons were almost forgotten. Dragons do not seem so important when they are dead and gone, and, there never was a reward offered. And what did Father and Mother say when Effie and Harry got home? My dear, that is the sort of silly question you children always will ask. However, just for this once, I don't mind telling you. Mother said, "Oh, my darlings, you're safe. You're safe. You naughty children, how could you be so disobedient? Go to bed at once." And their father, the doctor, said, "I wish I had known what you were going to do. I should have liked to preserve a specimen. I threw away the one I got out of Effie's eye. I intended to get a more perfect specimen. I did not anticipate this immediate extinction of the species." The professor said nothing, but he rubbed his hands. He had kept his specimen, the one the size of an earwig that he gave Harry half a crown for, and he has it to this day. You must get him to show it to you. The Ice Dragon, or Do As You Are Told. This is a tale of the wonders that befell on the evening of the 11th of December, when they did what they were told not to do. You may think that you know all the unpleasant things that could possibly happen to you if you are disobedient, but there are some things which even you do not know, and they did not know them either. Their names were George and Jane. There were no fireworks that year on Guy Fawkes Day because the heir to the throne was not well. He was cutting his first tooth, and that is a very anxious time for any person, even for a royal one. He was really very poorly, so that fireworks would have been in the worst possible taste, even at Land's End or in the Isle of Man, whilst in Forest Hill, which was the home of Jane and George, anything of the kind was quite out of the question. Even the Crystal Palace, empty-headed as it is, felt that this was no time for Catherine Wheels. But when the prince had cut his tooth, rejoicings were not only admissible but correct, and the 11th of December was proclaimed Firework Day. All the people were most anxious to show their loyalty and enjoy themselves at the same time. So there were fireworks and torchlight processions and set pieces at the Crystal Palace with blessings on our prince and long live our royal darling in different coloured fires, and the most private of boarding schools had a half-holiday, and even the children of plumbers and authors had twopence each given to them to spend as they liked. George and Jane had sixpence each, and they spent the whole amount on a golden rain, which would not light for ever so long, and when it did light, went out almost at once. So they had to look at the fireworks in the gardens next door, and at the ones at the Crystal Palace, which were very glorious indeed. All their relations had colds in their heads, so Jane and George were allowed to go out into the garden alone to let off their firework. Jane had put on her fur cape and her thick gloves, and a hood with a silver fox fur on it that was made out of Mother's old muff. And George had his overcoat with the 3 capes, and his comforter, and Father's sealskin travelling cap with the pieces that come down over your ears. It was dark in the garden, but the fireworks all about made it seem very gay, and though the children were cold, they were quite sure that they were enjoying themselves. They got up on the fence at the end of the garden to see better, and then they saw, very far away where the edge of the dark world is, a shining line of straight, beautiful lights arranged in a row, as if they were the spears carried by a fairy army. "Oh, how pretty," said Jane. "I wonder what they are. It looks as if the fairies were planting little shiny baby poplar trees and watering them with liquid light." "Liquid fiddlestick," said George. He had been to school, so he knew that these were only the aurora borealis, or northern lights, and he said so. "But what is the Rory Bory what's-its-name?" asked Jane. "Who lights it, and what's it there for?" George had to own that he had not learned that. "But I know," said he, "that it has something to do with the Great Bear, and the Dipper, and the Plough, and Charles Wain." "And what are they?" asked Jane. "Oh, they're the surnames of some of the star families." "There goes the Jolly Rocket," answered George, and Jane felt as if she almost understood about the star families. The fairy spears of light twinkled and gleamed. They were much prettier than the big, blaring, blazing bonfire that was smoking and flaming and spluttering in the next door but one garden. Prettier even than the coloured fires at the Crystal Palace. "I wish we could see them nearer," Jane said. "I wonder the star families are nice families. The kind that Mother would like us to go to tea with if we were little stars." "They aren't that sort of families at all, silly," said her brother, kindly trying to explain. "I only said families because a kid like you wouldn't have understood if I'd said and besides, I've forgotten the end of the word. Anyway, the stars are all up in the sky, so you can't go to tea with them." "No," said Jane. "I said if you were little stars." "But we aren't," said George. "No," said Jane with a sigh. "I know that. I'm not so stupid as you think, George, but the Tory Bories are somewhere at the edge. Couldn't we go and see them?" "Considering you're 8, you haven't much sense." George kicked his boots against the fencing to warm his toes. "It's half the world away." "It looks very near," said Jane, hunching up her shoulders to keep her neck warm. "They're close to the North Pole," said George. "Look here, I don't care a straw about the aurora borealis, but I shouldn't mind discovering the North Pole. It's awfully difficult and dangerous, and then you come home and write a book about it with a lot of pictures, and everybody says how brave you are." Jane got off the fence. "Oh, George, let's," she said. "We shall never have such a chance again, all alone by ourselves, and quite late, too." "I'd go right enough if it wasn't for you," George answered gloomily. "But you know, they always say I lead you into mischief, and if we went to the North Pole, we should get our boots wet, as likely as not. And you remember what they said about not going on the grass." "They said the lawn," said Jane. "We're not going on the lawn." "Oh, George, do let's. It doesn't look so very far. We could be back before they had time to get dreadfully angry." "All right," said George, "but mind, I don't want to go." So off they went. They got over the fence, which was very cold and white and shiny because it was beginning to freeze, and on the other side of the fence was somebody else's garden, so they got out of that as quickly as they could. And beyond that was a field where there was another big bonfire, with people standing around it who looked quite dark-skinned. "It's like Indians," said George, and wanted to stop and look. Jane pulled him on, and they passed by the bonfire and got through a gap in the hedge into another field, a dark one, and far away, beyond quite a number of other dark fields, the northern lights shone and sparkled and twinkled. Now, during the winter, the Arctic regions come much farther south than they are marked on the map. Very few people know this, though you would think they could tell it by the ice in the jugs of a morning. And just when George and Jane were starting for the North Pole, the Arctic regions had come down very nearly as far as Forest Hill, so that, as the children walked on, it grew colder and colder, and presently they saw that the fields were covered with snow, and there were great icicles hanging from all the hedges and gates. And the northern lights still seemed some way off. They were crossing a very rough, snowy field when Jane first noticed the animals. There were white rabbits and white hares and all sorts and sizes of white birds, and some larger creatures in the shadows of the hedges that Jane was sure were wolves and bears. "Polar bears and Arctic wolves, of course I mean," she said, for she did not want George to think her stupid again. There was a great hedge at the end of this field, all covered with snow and icicles, but the children found a place where there was a hole, and as no bears or wolves seemed to be just in that part of the hedge, they crept through and scrambled out of the frozen ditch onto the other side. And then they stood still and held their breath with wonder. For in front of them, running straight and smooth right way to the northern lights, lay a great wide road of pure dark ice, and on each side were tall trees all sparkling with white frost, and from the boughs of the tree hung strings of stars threaded on fine moonbeams and shining so brightly that it was like a beautiful fairy daylight. Jane said so, but George said it was like the electric lights at the Earl's Court exhibition. The rows of trees went as straight as ruled lines away, away and away, and at the other end of them shone the aurora borealis. There was a signpost of silvery snow, and on it in letters of pure ice the children read, "This way to the North Pole." Then George said, "Way or no way, I know a slide when I see one, so here goes." And he took a run on the frozen snow, and Jane took a run when she saw him do it, and the next moment they were sliding away, each with feet half a yard apart, along the great slide that leads to the North Pole. This great slide is made for the convenience of the polar bears who, during the winter months, get their food from the Army and Navy stores, and it is the most perfect slide in the world. If you have never come across it, it is because you have never let off fireworks on the 11th of December, and have never been thoroughly naughty and disobedient. But do not be these things in the hope of finding the great slide, because you might find something quite different, and then you will be sorry. The great slide is like common slides in that when once you have started, you have to go on to the end, unless you fall down, and then it hurts just as much as the smaller kind on ponds. The great slide runs downhill all the way so that you keep on going faster and faster and faster. George and Jane went so fast that they had not time to notice the scenery. They only saw the long lines of frosted trees and the starry lamps, and on each side, rushing back as they slid on, a very broad white world and a very large black night. And overhead, as well in the trees, the stars were bright like silver lamps, and far ahead shone and trembled and sparkled like the line of fairy spears. Jane said that, and George said, "I can see the northern lights quite plain." It is very pleasant to slide and slide and slide on clear, dark ice, especially if you feel you are really going somewhere, and more especially if that somewhere is the North Pole. The children's feet made no noise on the ice, and they went on and on in a beautiful white silence. But suddenly, the silence was shattered, and a cry rang out over the snow. "Hey, you there, stop! Tumble for your life!" cried George, and he fell down at once, because it is the only way to stop. Jane fell on top of him, and then they crawled on hands and knees to the snow at the edge of the slide. And there was a sportsman, dressed in a peaked cap and a frozen mustache, like the ones you see in the pictures about Ice Peter, and he had a gun in his hand. "You don't happen to have any bullets about you?" said he. "No," George said truthfully. "I had 5 of Father's revolver cartridges, but they were taken away the day Nurse turned out my pockets to see if I had taken the knob of the bathroom door by mistake." "Quite so," said the sportsman. "These accidents will occur. You don't carry firearms then, I presume?" "I haven't any firearms," said George, "but I have a firework. It's only a squib one of the boys gave me, if that's any good." Then he began to feel among the string and peppermints and buttons and tops and nibs and chalk and foreign postage stamps in his knickerbocker pockets. "One could but try," the sportsman replied, and he held out his hand. But Jane pulled at her brother's jacket tail and whispered, "Ask him what he wants it for." So then the sportsman had to confess that he wanted the firework to kill the white grouse with. And when they came to look, there was the white grouse himself sitting in the snow, looking quite pale and careworn, and waiting anxiously for the matter to be decided one way or the other. George put all the things back in his pockets and said, "No, I shan't. The reason for shooting him stopped yesterday. I heard Father say so it wouldn't be fair anyhow. I'm very sorry, but I can't, so there." The sportsman said nothing, only he shook his fist at Jane, and then he got on the slide and tried to go toward the Crystal Palace, which was not easy because that way is uphill. So they left him trying and went on. Before they started, the white grouse thanked them in a few pleasant, well-chosen words, and then they took a sideways slanting run and started off again on the great slide, and so away toward the North Pole and the twinkling, beautiful lights. The great slide went on, and the lights did not seem to come much nearer, and the white silence wrapped around them as they slid along the wide, icy path. Then, once again, the silence was broken to bits by someone yelling, "Hey, you there, stop!" "Tumble for your life!" cried George, and tumbled as before, stopping in the only possible way, and Jane stopped on top of him, and they crawled to the edge and came suddenly on a butterfly collector, who was looking for specimens with a pair of blue glasses and a blue net and a blue book with coloured plates. "Excuse me," said the collector, "but have you such a thing as a needle about you? A very long needle?" "I have a needle book," replied Jane politely, "but there aren't any needles in it now. George took them to do all the things with pieces of cork in the Boy's Own Scientific Experimenter and the Young Mechanic. He did not do the things, but he did for the needles." "Curiously enough," said the collector, "I too wish to use the needle in connection with cork." "I have a hat pin in my hood," said Jane. "I fastened the fur with it when it caught in the nail in the greenhouse door. It is very long and sharp. Would that do?" "One could but try," said the collector, and Jane began to feel for the pin. But George pinched her arm and whispered, "Ask what he wants it for." And then the collector had to own that he wanted the pin to stick through the great Arctic moth. "A magnificent specimen," he added, "which I am most anxious to preserve." And there, sure enough, in the collector's butterfly net sat the great Arctic moth, listening attentively to the conversation. "Oh, I couldn't," cried Jane, and while George was explaining to the collector that they would really rather not, Jane opened the blue folds of the butterfly net and asked the moth quietly if it would please step outside for a moment. And it did. When the collector saw that the moth was free, he seemed less angry than grieved. "Well, well," said he, "here's a whole Arctic expedition thrown away. I shall have to go home and fit out another, and that means a lot of writing to the papers and things. You seem to be a singularly thoughtless little girl." So they went on, leaving him too, trying to go uphill towards the Crystal Palace. When the great white Arctic moth had returned thanks in a suitable speech, George and Jane took a sideways slanting run and started sliding again between the star lamps along the great slide towards the North Pole. They went fast and faster, and the lights ahead grew brighter and brighter, so that they could not keep their eyes open, but had to blink and wink as they went. And then suddenly the great slide ended in an immense heap of snow, and George and Jane shot right into it, because they could not stop themselves, and the snow was soft, so they went in up to their very ears. When they had picked themselves out and thumped each other on the back to get rid of the snow, they shaded their eyes and looked, and there, right in front of them, was the wonder of wonders, the North Pole, towering high and white and glistening like an ice-white lighthouse. And it was quite close, so that you had to put your head as far back as it would go, and farther, before you could see the high top of it. It was made entirely of ice. You will hear grown-up people talk a great deal of nonsense about the North Pole, and when you are grown up, it is even possible that you may talk nonsense about it yourself. The most unlikely things do happen. But deep down in your heart, you must always remember that the North Pole is made of clear ice, and could not, possibly, if you come to think of it, be made of anything else. All around the pole, making a bright ring about it, were hundreds of little fires, and the flames of them did not flicker and twist, but went up, blue and green and rosy and straight, like the stalks of dream lilies. Jane said so, but George said they were as straight as ramrods. And these flames were the aurora borealis, which the children had seen as far away as Forest Hill. The ground was quite flat and covered with smooth, hard snow, which shone and sparkled like the top of a birthday cake that has been iced at home. The ones done at the shops do not shine and sparkle, because they mix flour with the icing sugar. "It is like a dream," said Jane. And George said, "It is the North Pole. Just think of the fuss people always make about getting here. And it was no trouble at all, really." "I dare say lots of people have gotten here," said Jane dismally. "It's not the getting here, I see that. It's the getting back again. Perhaps no one will ever know that we have ever been here, and the robins will cover us with leaves and—" "Nonsense," said George. "There aren't any robins, and there aren't any leaves. There's just the North Pole, that's all, and I found it. And now I shall try to climb up and plant the British flag on the top. My handkerchief will do, and if it really is the North Pole, my pocket compass Uncle James gave me will spin around and around, and then I shall know. Come on." So Jane came on, and when they got close to the clear, tall, beautiful flames, they saw that there was a great, queer-shaped lump of ice all around the bottom of the pole. Clear, smooth, shining ice that was deep, beautiful Prussian blue like icebergs in the thick parts, and all sorts of wonderful, glimmery, shimmery, changing colours in the thin parts, like the cut-glass chandelier in Grandmamma's house in London. "It is a very curious shape," said Jane. "It's almost like—" She moved back a step to get a better view of it. "It's almost like a dragon." "It's much more like the lampposts on the Thames embankment," said George, who had noticed a curly thing like a tail that went twisting up the North Pole. "Oh, George," cried Jane, "it is a dragon. I can see its wings. Whatever shall we do?" And sure enough, it was a dragon. A great, shining, winged, scaly, clawy, big-mouthed dragon made of pure ice. It must have gone to sleep curled around the hole where those warm steam used to come up from the middle of the earth, and then, when the earth got colder and the columns of steam froze, it was turned into the North Pole. The dragon must have gotten frozen in his sleep, frozen too hard to move, and there he stayed. And though he was very terrible, he was very beautiful too. Jane said so, but George said, "Oh, don't bother. I'm thinking how to get onto the pole and try the compass without waking the brute." The dragon certainly was beautiful, with his deep, clear Prussian blueness and his rainbow-coloured glitter. And rising from within the cold coil of the frozen dragon, the North Pole shot up like a pillar made of one great diamond, and every now and then it cracked a little from sheer cold. The sound of the cracking was the only thing that broke the great white silence in the midst of which the dragon lay like an enormous jewel, and the straight flames went up all around him like the stalks of tall lilies. And as the children stood there, looking at the most wonderful sight their eyes had ever seen, there was a soft padding of feet and a hurry-scurry behind them, and from the outside darkness beyond the flame stalks came a crowd of little brown creatures, running, jumping, scrambling, tumbling head over heels and on all fours, and some even walking on their heads. They joined hands as they came round near the fires and danced around in a ring. "It's bears," said Jane. "I know it is. How I wish we hadn't come, and my boots are so wet." The dancing ring broke up suddenly, and the next moment hundreds of furry arms clutched at George and Jane, and they found themselves in the middle of a great soft heaving crowd of little fat people in brown fur dresses, and the white silence was quite gone. "Bears indeed!" cried a shrill voice. "You'll wish we were bears before you're done with us." This sounded so dreadful that Jane began to cry. Up to now, the children had only seen the most beautiful and wondrous things, but now they began to be sorry they had done what they were told not to, and the difference between lawn and grass did not seem so great as it had at Forest Hill. Directly, Jane began to cry. All the brown people started back. No one cries in the Arctic regions for fear of being struck by the frost, so that these people had never seen anyone cry before. "Don't cry for real," whispered George, "or you'll get chilblains in your eyes. But pretend to howl. It frightens them." So Jane went on pretending to howl, and the real crying stopped. It always does when you begin to pretend. You try it. Then, speaking very loud so as to be heard over the howls of Jane, George said, "Yeah, who's afraid? We are George and Jane. Who are you?" "We are the sealskin dwarves," said the brown people, twisting their furry bodies in and out of the crowd like the changing glass in kaleidoscopes. "We are very precious and expensive, for we are made throughout of the very best sealskin." "And what are those fires for?" bellowed George, for Jane was crying louder and louder. "Those," shouted the dwarves, coming a step nearer, "are the fires we make to Thor the dragon. He is frozen now, so he sleeps curled up around the pole. But when we have thawed him with our fires, he will wake up and go and eat everybody in the world except us." Whatever do you want him to do that for? Yelled George. Oh, just for spite, bawled the dwarves carelessly, as if they were saying, just for fun. Jane stopped crying to say, You are heartless. No, we aren't, they said. Our hearts are made of the finest sealskin, just like little fat sealskin purses. And they all came a step nearer. They were very fat and round. Their bodies were like sealskin jackets on a very stout person. Their heads were like sealskin muffs, their legs were like sealskin boas, and their hands and feet were like sealskin tobacco pouches. And their faces were like seals' faces, insomuch as they too were covered with sealskin. Thank you so much for telling us, said George. Good evening. Keep on howling, Jane. But the dwarves came a step nearer, muttering and whispering. Then the muttering stopped, and there was a silence so deep that Jane was afraid to howl in it. But it was a brown silence, and she had liked the white silence better. Then the chief dwarf came quite close and said, What's that on your head? And George felt it was all up, for he knew it was his father's sealskin cap. The dwarf did not wait for an answer. It's made of one of us, he screamed, or else one of the seals, our poor relations. Boy, now your fate is sealed. Looking at the wicked seal faces all around them, George and Jane felt that their fate was sealed indeed. The dwarves seized the children in their furry arms. George kicked, but it is no use kicking sealskin, and Jane howled, but the dwarves were getting used to that. They climbed up the dragon's side and dumped the children down on his icy spine with their backs against the North Pole. You have no idea how cold it was, the kind of cold that makes you feel small and prickly inside your clothes, and makes you wish you had 20 times as many clothes to feel small and prickly inside of. The sealskin dwarves tied George and Jane to the North Pole, and, as they had no ropes, they bound them with snow wreaths, which are very strong when they are made in the proper way, and they heaped up the fires very close and said, Now the dragon will get warm, and when he gets warm he will wake, and when he wakes he will be hungry. And when he is hungry, he will begin to eat, and the first thing he will eat will be you. The little, sharp, many-colored flames sprang up like the stalks of dream lilies, but no heat came to the children, and they grew colder and colder. We shan't be very nice when the dragon does eat us, that's one comfort, said George. We shall be turned into ice long before that. Suddenly, there was a flapping of wings, and the white growls perched on the dragon's head and said, Can I be of any assistance? Now, by this time, the children were so cold, so very, very cold, that they had forgotten everything but that, and they could say nothing else. So the white growls said, One moment. I am only too grateful for this opportunity of showing my sense of your manly conduct about the firework. And the next moment, there was a soft whispering rustle of wings overhead, and then fluttering slowly, softly down, came hundreds and thousands of little white fluffy feathers. They fell on George and Jane like snowflakes, and, like flakes of fallen snow lying one above another, they grew into a thicker and thicker covering, so that presently the children were buried under a heap of white feathers, and only their faces peeped out. Oh, you dear, good, kind white growls, said Jane. But you'll be cold yourself, won't you, now you have given us all your pretty dear feathers? The white grouse laughed, and his laugh was echoed by thousands of kind, soft bird voices. Did you think all those feathers came out of one breast? There are hundreds and hundreds of us here, and every one of us can spare a little tuft of soft breast feathers to help to keep two kind little hearts warm. Thus spoke the grouse, who certainly had very pretty manners. So now the children snuggled under the feathers and were warm, and when the sealskin dwarfs tried to take the feathers away, the grouse and his friends flew in their faces with flappings and screams and drove the dwarfs back. They are a cowardly folk. The dragon had not moved yet, but then he might at any moment get warm enough to move, and though George and Jane were now warm, they were not comfortable nor easy in their minds. They tried to explain to the grouse, but though he is polite, he is not clever, and he only said, "You've got a warm nest, and we'll see that no one takes it from you. What more can you possibly want?" Just then came a new, strange, jerky fluttering of wings far softer than the grouse's, and George and Jane cried out together, "Oh, do mind your wings in the fires!" For they saw at once that it was the great white Arctic moth. "What's the matter?" he asked, settling on the dragon's tail. So they told him. "Sealskin, are they?" said the moth. "Just you wait a minute." He flew off very crookedly, dodging the flames, and presently he came back, and there were so many moths with him that it was as if a live sheet of white wingedness were suddenly drawn between the children and the stars. And then the doom of the bad sealskin dwarfs fell suddenly on them. For the great sheet of winged whiteness broke up and fell as snow falls, and fell upon the sealskin dwarfs, and every snowflake of it was a live, fluttering, hungry moth that buried its greedy nose deep in the sealskin fur. Grown-up people will tell you that it is not moths, but moths' children who eat fur. But this is only when they are trying to deceive you. When they are not thinking about you, they say, "I fear the moths have got at my ermine tippet," or "Your poor Aunt Emma had a lovely sable cloak, but it was eaten by moths." And now there were more moths than have ever been together in this world before, all settling on the sealskin dwarfs. The dwarfs did not see their danger till it was too late. Then they called for camphor and bitter apple and oil of lavender and yellow soap and borax. And some of the dwarfs even started to get these things, but long before any of them could get to the chemist's, all was over. The moths ate and ate and ate, till the sealskin dwarfs, being sealskin throughout, even to the empty hearts of them, were eaten down to the very life, and they fell one by one on the snow, and so came to their end. And all around the North Pole, the snow was brown with their flat, bare pelts. "Oh, thank you, darling Arctic moth," cried Jane. "You are good. I do hope you haven't eaten enough to disagree with you afterward." Millions of moth voices answered with laughter as soft as moth wings. "We should be a poor set of fellows if we couldn't overeat ourselves once in a while to oblige a friend." And off they all fluttered, and the white grouse flew off, and all the sealskin dwarfs were all dead, and the fires went out, and George and Jane were left alone in the dark with the dragon. "Oh dear," said Jane, "this is the worst of all." "We've got no friends left to help us," said George. He never thought that the dragon himself might help them, but then that was an idea that would never have occurred to any boy. It grew colder and colder and colder, and even under the grouse feathers the children shivered. Then When it was so cold that it could not manage to be any colder without breaking the thermometer, it stopped. And then the dragon uncurled himself from around the North Pole and stretched his long, icy length over the snow and said, "This is something like. How faint those fires did make me feel." The fact was, the sealskin dwarves had gone the wrong way to work. The dragon had been frozen so long that now he was nothing but solid ice all through, and the fires only made him feel as if he were going to die. But when the fires were out, he felt quite well and very hungry. He looked around for something to eat, but he never noticed George and Jane because they were frozen to his back. He moved slowly off, and the snow wreaths that bound the children to the pole gave way with a snap, and there was the dragon crawling south with Jane and George on his great, scaly, icy, shining back. Of course, the dragon had to go south if he went anywhere, because when you get to the North Pole, there is no other way to go. The dragon rattled and tinkled as he went, exactly like the cut glass chandelier when you touch it, as you are strictly forbidden to do. Of course, there are a million ways of going south from the North Pole, so you will own that it was lucky for George and Jane when the dragon took the right way, and suddenly got his heavy feet on the great slide. Off he went full speed between the starry lamps, toward Forest Hill and the Crystal Palace. "He's going to take us home," said Jane. "Oh, he is a good dragon. I am glad." George was rather glad too, though neither of the children felt at all sure of their welcome, especially as their feet were wet, and they were bringing a strange dragon home with them. They went very fast, because dragons can go uphill as easily as down. You would not understand why, if I told you, because you are only in long division at present. Yet if you want me to tell you so that you can show off to other children, I will. It is because dragons can get their tails into the fourth dimension and hold on there, and when you can do that, everything else is easy. The dragon went very fast, only stopping to eat the collector and the sportsmen, who were still struggling to go up the slide, vainly because they had no tails and had never even heard of the fourth dimension. When the dragon got to the end of the slide, he crawled very slowly across the dark field beyond the field where there was a bonfire, next to the next-door garden at Forest Hill. He went slower and slower, and in the bonfire field he stopped altogether. And because the Arctic regions had not gone down so far as that, and because the bonfire was very hot, the dragon began to melt and melt and melt. And before the children knew what he was doing, they found themselves sitting in a large pool of water, and their boots were as wet, and there was not a bit of dragon left. So they went indoors. Of course, some grown-up or other noticed at once that the boots of George and Jane were wet and muddy, and they had both been sitting down in a very damp place, so they were sent to bed immediately. It was long past their time anyhow. Now, if you are of an inquiring mind, not at all a nice thing in a little child who reads fairy tales, you will want to know how it is that since the sealskin dwarves have all been killed and the fires all been let out, the aurora borealis shines on cold nights as brightly as ever. My dear, I do not know. I am not too proud to own that there are some things I know nothing about, and this is one of them. But I do know that whoever has lighted those fires again, it is certainly not the sealskin dwarves. They were all eaten by moths, and moth-eaten things are of no use, even to light